Thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think today the topic that I discussed with Laura and with Aaron about sort of giving a class about was this idea of thinking beyond just risks and really trying to unpack why foresight and policy should reframe the unknowns that it tries to deal with away from just thinking about risk, and I'll explain why, into different types of not knowing, which are different types of uncertainty. So one thing which I wanted to say at the very beginning is I'm going to talk for maybe about 20, maybe a little bit more minutes. And then Cheryl and I are going to engage in a pretty gloves off conversation about some of the things we're talking about. And I know the norm is, this can be background listening if you want, but if you have a difficult question, don't feel shy to pull it up, right? Because I'm thinking through a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about. I really actually do welcome critique of any sort. And so if you have a question, bring it up. If you have an objection to something, definitely do bring it up. Very much welcome. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm just gonna start by using an example of why thinking about the words we use to talk about unknowns is important. I used to live in San Francisco where there were critical mass movements, like where bicyclists agitated on the streets to make streets safer for people who are cyclists. At the same time, there's also lots of people who think bikes are bad. Now, if you think that bikes are motorbikes, you might think bikes are terrible because they're less safe than cars or less safe than bicycles. But if you think that bikes are, pedaling bikes, you might think that building infrastructure and a culture of commuting by bicycle is actually amazing. The problem with this sort of two worlds, maybe at odds with each other way of thinking about things, is that the word bike actually has two distinct meanings. It comes with two sets of assumptions that we're making about what a bike is. And both worlds are right. It's just that both worlds are using the same word to describe something which is actually different. The point I'm trying to make with this example, which I've actually stolen from someone else, is it's vital to use different words for different things. And policy and strategy about decision-making, and decision-making is especially hard when there are unknowns. The big sort of headliner for today, I guess, for me, is that uncertainty is a different type of unknown compared to risk. Good decision-making depends on being able to distinguish between the two, and also in seeing the possibilities that arise when we are able to see different kinds of uncertainty, what I call different types of not knowing. So the too long didn't read version, if you only remember two things from today's talk, the two things are, if you mistake uncertainty for risk, bad outcomes result, as both a policymaker as well as a strategist. And also, if you don't understand what the different types of not knowing are, the different types of non-risk uncertainty are, you also miss opportunities for generativity, right? For innovation and doing something new. And so in today's talk, I'm going to try and unpack some of this stuff. I'll explain the difference between risk and uncertainty. And then I'll talk a little bit about these different types of uncertainty that give you different opportunities for doing new stuff. As Dexter says, I'm not really going to go through this because Dexter already said it. The one thing which I wanted to say about all the things that I've done is that in every one of these things that I'm doing, I'm really trying to think about what strategy we should have for dealing with situations where the unknowns that we face are not risky and calculable, but instead they are unknown, unquantified, emergent in some way. And where I tend to apply that stuff is to strategy, for one, but also to thinking about how you design organizations that can deal with uncertainty, not just risk, and also in thinking about how uncertainty is inextricably connected with innovation and doing anything new. So before I worked with governments as much as I currently do and with multilaterals, I'm actually in New York doing some work for the UN. I used to work in the private sector. So I used to work at Google for a little bit, and I mostly, while I was at Google, helped them think practically about exploring areas of unknowns in relation to new products for them. So I used to work on Google Maps, and the thing which I worked on Google Maps for them for was to try and understand how a space of putting other information, not yet currently known about, onto a map could let you discover new things about all that information and about the map as well. So, okay, this is the agenda for today. It looks like a lot of things. I'm going to go through them relatively fast. I'm very happy to follow up with anyone who's interested after the fact. There'll be contact information throughout. So the first thing I wanted to say is, what is the difference between uncertainty and risk? Why even bother distinguishing between the two of them? I think the reason is because the world that we're facing, especially if you're in the business of policy or foresight, is one that is not risky. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later on. But just last year, in Valencia, there were these enormous floods, right? And these enormous floods, in one single day, one entire year's worth of rain fell. And this was historically unprecedented. If you think about what it means for something to be historically unprecedented, it means that that event, this flood, was something that you could not learn from the past about. It's not the only thing that's happened in the last year that has been like that. The reason for some of the uncertainties that we're facing is because the decisions that we made in the past, for example, about urbanism, are no longer consistent with the environment that we're facing. In this case, climate unpredictability. So in January this year, 7 wildfires in LA caused evacuation of 200,000 people, destroyed 18,000 structures, covering 57,000 acres of land, 50 billion of losses, of which only 20 billion were insured, right? These were some of the biggest fires in an urban area that have ever happened. And the reason for it, you'll see on the screen, is there was a trifecta of factors that came together. So not only are we seeing the environment be unpredictable in ways that we didn't expect, it's also that the intersections of a whole bunch of uncertainties cause things that we don't have preparations for. Now, as I said before, policy and strategy are decision-making functions, and decisions are made by making assumptions about what kinds of unknowns we face when we're choosing what actions we take. And when we make those decisions about policy and strategy on the assumption that the future is in some way predictable, that the future is something that we can learn from the past from, that's dangerous, right? If the world is increasingly uncertain, not just risky. So what is the difference between uncertainty and risk? I think it's important to talk about this very quickly before I go into the rest of it. Both risk and uncertainty entail not knowing exactly what is going to happen in the future. But in a situation of risk, you know actually all the possible actions you could take, all the outcomes that might result, you know their respective probabilities accurately and precisely. You've got a point estimate that is not only a point, but also an accurate point. It's not in the wrong place on this like continuum of probabilities, right? And you also know each possible outcome's relative value relative to other outcomes. You know how much you want one outcome rather than another outcome. What this means is risky situations are within distribution. Like you know some distribution of events and outcomes historically, and you know where inside you expect this thing that you are confronting to be, or you can extrapolate that accurately. Risk is therefore something which you can calculate, you can optimize, you can ensure about, and you can learn about risk from experience. What this means is even though risk is something which you don't know about, risk is comforting. And the reality is there is not that much actual risk in the real world, certainly not in the world that if you are in the public sector, the world that you confront is not one that is mostly risky. The world of mostly risk is the world of games, right? The world of games where rules apply and are fully specifiable, where the number of actions you can take are also specified by the rules of the game, where there are a fixed number of turns that you can expect to end at some point, and where you know how valuable a winning condition is. Uncertainty is not like that at all, right? Uncertainty means not knowing all of the possible actions and or the possible outcomes and or their respective probabilities and or their respective outcome values. What this means is the kinds of situations that are unknown that policymakers or people in the public sector face all the time are largely uncertain, not risky, right? Blowing up a gas pipeline that serves most of Europe, is that risky? I would say it's not, it's uncertain. The advent of a new technology like AI, is that risky? No, we have no idea what it's going to do. I think that's uncertain. Elon Musk and Doge, would you have predicted that 4 years ago? No, it's uncertain. So all of these things that we have to deal with, or I should say, I'm not in the public sector myself directly. You all, if you work in the public sector, you have to deal with most of these wicked problems, especially, are things that are mostly uncertain, not mostly risky. And the problem is, therefore, that if uncertainty is unquantifiable and uninsurable, the past can't really teach us a lot about what to do to confront it. And that's what makes uncertainty really deeply uncomfortable. We generally, as humans, try not to do and think about uncertain things because they're uncomfortable. The problem is that all the rigorous decision-making approaches that we have, that we use, that we're used to, they ultimately boil down to expected value calculations or cost-benefit analyses. And those actually require risk assumptions to be upheld. In order to do an expected value calculation or a cost-benefit analysis, you must know all the possible things you could do, all the possible outcomes that could result. You must know they're accurate and precise probabilities in causation, and you also have to know how much they're worth. If you don't know any of those four things, the analyses and the results are uninterpretable and they're unreliable. This means that almost all of the ways that we have making decisions when things are unknown break down when faced with true uncertainty. So the problem, so remember I said the too long didn't read, there are only two things. One of them is you make bad decisions when you conflate uncertainty and risk. The reason why is when you conflate uncertainty and risk, you have a problem of misdiagnosis that has consequences which can be profound and long-lasting. Some of you may, I mean, everyone here knows what this thing is. This is the COVID-19 coronavirus. And I'm going to use an example of what the World Health Organization did in response to this very early in the COVID epidemic. And this is not a criticism of the World Health Organization, it is a criticism of the way they made decisions in this situation. In February 2020, there was a huge amount that was unknown about this new virus, right? A very, very large city in China, bigger than most cities in Europe, had shut down completely. And nobody knew, even I think with any great precision, what the pathogen was, let alone how it really spreads, how virulent it could be, how lethal it could be. There were not really any calculable unknowns. And yet the World Health Organization in February 2020 released official guidance globally. And the guidance was not to impose restrictions on travel or trade. They made this decision to issue this guidance based on what they call a careful risk assessment, a cost-benefit analysis of how much it would cost to shut down travel and trade versus the expected benefits from doing that. The numbers that they input into this cost-benefit analysis partly came from epidemiological data from the SARS outbreak, which turns out to have very different epidemiological characteristics from COVID. The question which I put to all of you is a careful risk assessment the right tool for the job when the situation is uncertain, not risky? And I argue that it's not. An uncertain situation that's misdiagnosed as risky means that you use a risk-oriented decision-making approach inappropriately in an uncertain situation. And the result is actually you don't achieve the outcome that you were hoping for, right? So this is what happened to world GDP in that same quarter. It turns out the analysis was poor, right? It mischaracterized the situation as being risky and applied risk methods for developing strategy, like a cost-benefit analysis, instead of recognizing it as uncertain and then doing appropriate decision-making for an uncertain situation. Later on, I hope that Cheryl will ask me, and I hope you all will ask me, what I think appropriate decision-making methods are for uncertainty. I've got some suggestions, but I'm going to talk about some of the other stuff first. Okay, so the too long didn't read version of that section is that uncertainty is not the same thing as risk. Uncertainty requires a fundamentally different approach to thinking about how you make decisions compared to risk, and that accurate diagnosis of the situation you're facing. Is it risky or is it uncertain is crucial for choosing appropriate decision-making approaches. And this, I hope it's obvious to you guys because it seems very, very obvious to me. If you're making recommendations to political office holders, if you're making policy recommendations or policy strategy recommendations, I think in the public sector is absolutely crucial to recognize the difference in a situation that you're facing that is uncertain or that's risky. All right, now, the second thing that I said I wanted you all to come away from this conversation about is, the first one, by the way, is bad decisions result when you conflate uncertainty with risk. The second one is you miss opportunities for doing cool stuff if you don't understand the nuances of the different kinds of uncertainty that we face. So now we're going to talk about that a bit. It says here uncertainty is not enough. Now, I'll give an example of this. So COVID, huge amounts of uncertainty. We have no idea what's going to happen. And then on the right-hand side, you also have a situation, this is like over 150 years ago. Well, I mean, this particular photograph is from like less than 100 years ago, when there was still a situation where we didn't know whether or not in some countries women would have the right to vote. In both of these cases, you've got uncertainty, right? COVID, we've got uncertainty about what we can do about it. And in the situation of suffrage, we've got uncertainty about how valuable particular humans in society are as political entities. That uncertainty actually creates space for doing new things. This is the undeniable, unavoidable reality of any kind of innovation, which is that innovation is only possible when there is not knowing about what can happen next. And the different kinds of not knowing about what can happen next, in the case of coronavirus, the not knowing about what can happen next results in all of a sudden there is an environment where a not very popular technology, mRNA vaccination, becomes the only thing, or one of the only things that becomes a possible way of vaccinating enough people and developing a vaccine fast enough to be able to deal with the rapidly evolving coronavirus. So this situation of uncertainty that COVID creates gives us the opportunity of doing something that now gives us, again, the possibility of potentially cancer cures, right? That the mRNA vaccine technology enables. In the same way, if you think about a situation where it's not clear whether or not women should have the vote, or earlier, whether slaves should have the vote, that creates space for social action to create a situation where maybe you can agitate for women to have the vote or for slaves to become enfranchised as well. There are many types of non-risk unknowns. Each one of these, and I can explain and give some examples, each one of these is potentially generative of innovation and novelty in different ways. The problem is we only use one word for all of it. We use the word uncertainty, and it's a blanket phrase or term that we use to cover all of these different kinds of not knowing that we face. And the fact that we don't have different words to talk about these different kinds of not knowing means that we can't make as good use of these different kinds of not knowing as we otherwise could. So I won't have time today to talk about each one of these 4 types of not knowing in great detail, but I will talk about the 4 types. The 4 types of not knowing that are not risk are not knowing about what actions are possible, not knowing about what outcomes might result, not knowing about the causation between actions and outcomes, and not knowing, and this one's the most important thing I think for the public sector, not knowing about how relatively or subjectively valuable any particular outcome might be. If you look on this slide, you'll see these QR codes. If you're interested in any one of these kinds of not knowings specifically, there are short essays about each one at each one of these QR codes. And I'm also going to send the slides around, so you don't have to take a photograph now if you don't want to. In a situation of not knowing about actions, the correct action to take is to search for new actions you could take. In a situation where you don't know what outcomes are possible, you should actually go out and search for other outcomes that already exist that you simply didn't know about. In a situation where you don't know about causation, this is something that we understand a lot in science. We look for ways of establishing and measuring causation. We do experiments. And when we don't know about value, this is when we interrogate values. We ask ourselves, is the thing that we value now something we should value permanently or not? Are there things that we should value more? Are there new things we should value as well? Apologies. One of the things that acknowledging not knowing about value also forces us to do is it forces us to think, are we asking all the people who we should be asking about what's valuable, right? Do we have a sense from the breadth of stakeholders about what's a relatively valuable outcome to them? I think in recent years in developed democracies, we're seeing the effects of not really asking that question of the right people. And then groundswells of dissatisfaction eventually result in changes in political power. I trust that what I'm talking about is evident in this particular group. So I wanted to just talk very quickly about 2 last things, the upside potential from not knowing, and then some decision-making tools, some concrete things that you could do to make decisions when you are facing these different kinds of uncertainty. The upside potential, like I said before, we only have the ability to do new things when there is the possibility that there are new things to be done, which means you must have some sense in which you don't know exactly what's going to happen next. So here's an example. This was probably about 20 years ago. They did a war game, and the war game was quite a robustly set up one. And the red team in this instance won in just 2 minutes or 3 minutes or something. And the reason why was they used unconventional tactics, right? They basically used a lot of the guerrilla and pirate warfare tactics that now are commonplace. And because the training doctrine of the US military at the time simply excluded from consideration all of these, weird grassrootsy kinds of ways of doing war, the blue team lost. The report of how it was that red team won said that it was a strategy of ambiguity, asymmetry, and denial of territory. These are all tactics that come out of the ability to make strategic use of uncertainty and not knowing that is asymmetrical, right? The other side doesn't know how to deal with it, but you do. And if you know how to deal with it, but the other side doesn't, you are in a stronger position. This is the strong man version of why we should have a better way of dealing with, understanding, talking about the different kinds of uncertainty. It gives us leverage in situations where other sides may be becoming better at dealing with uncertainty than we are. We need to become as good as or better at dealing with uncertainty as they are. Now, I think that's the sort of hawkish way of thinking about it. But I also like to think about non-hawkish ways of thinking about why sophistication in thinking about not knowing is beneficial. Like I said, not knowing is the foundation of innovation. Everything new begins from not knowing what the new thing will be. And if we think about the 4 different types of not knowing that we have, each different type creates different possibilities of newness and innovation. I'll give you just a few examples. I'll give you 2 of them that maybe resonate a little bit more with the public sector. One of them is, if you don't know what things you can do, and you explicitly don't know what things you can do, one of the possible things that you can do is you can create the first free at point of service public health service in the entire world. Nobody had done it before. And if you are the Minister of Health at the time, you decide, actually, maybe we should try something like this. And you literally, you speech act it into existence, right? If this kind of not knowing was not possible, or was not something that, at the very least, leadership at that time was comfortable enough with, they were not actually comfortable with it, they were simply comfortable enough with it to do something about it, you would not have this literal act that creates the NHS, and you would not have the NHS. And it's very important to point out that at the time, nobody knew if it would work or how it would work, but they did it anyway. It was incredibly uncomfortable, but they leaned into the not knowing about actions to try out this action. And the result is the NHS. It still exists. It celebrated its 75th anniversary last year. Action not knowing makes space for new actions that could work. And if we have no space for new actions, that takes away many, many levers if you're in the public sector. The other one that I wanted to unpack a little bit more is not knowing about values. This is the one kind of uncertainty that is everywhere, and we tend not to talk about it very much, but it is, to me, incredibly important in the public sector. This is a photo, like I said, from the early 20th century. This was the headquarters of an anti-suffrage group in New York City. And underlying this photo and underlying this movement of anti-suffrage is the idea that women have values at the time only as homemakers and as mothers. They did not have and should not have value as political entities in the sense of voters who can be part of determining the political path of the country. I don't agree with this point of view, by the way. I'm simply saying this was one of the ways people thought about value at that time. This was the case in many countries, including France. In fact, there were almost no countries where women had the vote until the very early part of the 20th century. But there was enough space of possibility in what was valuable in a person that through enormous amounts of work and lobbying, protest, and coalition building, to change how society values the different roles that women play. And again, this change in what value is and who has value gets implemented through things that we have mechanisms for, right? Like they create acts of Congress or parliamentary acts, or in the case of France, like a different kind of Republic Act that give a new category of people an old right, because now they're valuable in an old way. It's also, by the way, if any of you work in the creative industries, this is not just for political sources of value. We also see art is actually one of the places where the changeability of what's considered valuable can be seen incredibly clearly, right? These are 3 portraits over multiple centuries of what's considered valuable in representation of a portrait. On the very far left, there's a lady with an ermine by Leonardo da Vinci. That's a fairly representative way of thinking about what a portrait looks like. In the middle is the portrait of a Polish woman by Modigliani. That's a different way of thinking about what portraiture looks like. And then on the far right is the head of JYM by Frank Auerbach. That's, again, a different way of thinking what's valuable. Each of these 3 paintings is a masterpiece and valuable in its own right. But the only way these are all valuable is if there has been the possibility of change in what is valuable in portraiture over the centuries. Now, again, I don't want to drive the point home too strongly, but I think this is generally true. It's true in politics, it's true in aesthetics, it's also true in business. If you think about in 2007, what was possible to think about as valuable in the state of the art in mobile phone technology, you actually had 2 simultaneously coexisting ideas of what a high quality phone was. How is that possible? It's only possible if there's a space for not knowing what's valuable. And of course, if you're thinking about real politics and political parties, I mean, all you have to do is see what's happening. This is just the UK last year, but you can also see the same thing happening. The same thing literally happened last year in France as well. I mean, not exactly the same thing, but something very similar. Okay, so I think value not knowing makes space for changing what outcomes we value and how much we value them. And if we don't fully understand the different kinds of not knowings that we face, not knowings about actions, outcomes, causation, and valuation, we can't benefit, we can't do things that push innovation and new things in each one of those spaces. So I think if you don't explicitly design not knowing into policy and strategy when you make recommendations about it, what you do is you actually remove space for generativity, innovation, and change, which is why I hope that at least some part of what I said today resonates and gets put into what you do in the public sector. Okay, the last thing, just two very quick slides because there's no time for it. I think there are decision-making tools for not knowing. We don't have many of them. We don't use them very often. But basically, if you have not knowing about actions, what you do is you build diverse portfolios of small experiments about possible actions. If you have not knowing about outcomes, you build diverse portfolios of small experiments about possible outcomes. If you're not knowing about causation, you experiment, right? You intentionally measure the causal variation in changing what you do and then seeing what happens as a result. And if you're not knowing about values, basically what you do is you start doing philosophy, but you have to do philosophy at grand scale. There are lots of tools actually that come from lots of different spaces that we don't tend to use for these things, but we should. And I'm happy to talk about all of them whenever anyone wants. But I think maybe now I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl to do a bit of reflection and wrap, and of course, open to everyone else who wants to ask a question too. Anyway, cool. Cheryl, over to you.